Welcome to the podcast, Leaders of Today, Teens to Titans. I am so honored to have our guest, Leah Rothchild, for an interview. Leah Rothchild has dedicated her life to ensuring that young people receive the kind of mental and emotional support she once needed herself. After graduating from Florida Atlantic University, she spent years on the front lines, working as a certified recovery support worker, supporting women and children facing housing insecurity, and volunteering with organizations focused on human trafficking and harm reduction. Those experiences, paired with a lifelong calling to improve the well-being of children, led her to pursue her master's in science in nursing at the Mass General Hospital Institute of Health Professions, where she quickly became known for her leadership and advocacy for equity and justice in healthcare. But Leah's commitment to this work didn't start in adulthood. As a teen, she struggled in silence with depression, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and substance abuse, while maintaining the appearance of a high-achieving, outgoing student. She remembers seeking help from her pediatrician and realizing that, despite genuine care, the system wasn't built to support a teen in that level of pain. That experience is the reason she is now pursuing dual certification as a pediatric and psychiatric nurse practitioner, with a vision of integrating accessible, stigma-free mental health care into everyday pediatric practice. Today, she's here to share how those early struggles shaped her leadership, what teens need from adults who serve them, and why redefining mental health as an essential part of whole health is the future she is working toward. You're listening to Today's Leaders, from Teens to Titans. Hi, I'm Lorraine Connell, a teen leadership coach. I transitioned from teaching chemistry to coaching teens in leadership, helping them realize they can do hard things. We've often believed that leadership is an innate trait, but it's actually a skill that you build and improve. On this show, you'll meet today's leaders who share their teenage experiences, revealing how they developed confidence, direction, and the tools to become the leaders they are now. You'll discover how you or the teens in your life have the potential to become confident leaders, even if it doesn't seem possible. Leah, I can't even tell you how grateful I am to have you today. I heard you speak a couple of months ago, and in that moment, I knew I needed you to come share your story on my podcast so more people can hear and experience through your eyes the journey that you went through to get to where you are today, which is so exciting.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So I ask all my guests, and you are no different, can you take a trip down memory lane and tell us who you were as a young person, how those experiences shaped who you are, and what you are aiming to do in your life today?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really important to break it into a few different time periods when I look back, because early childhood looked a lot different than my adolescence. So in early childhood, people described me as gifted, curious, joyful. I was independent. I was a leader. My parents tell me I never followed the crowd. I knew what I liked, and I didn't care if anybody came with me. I was a little bit defiant, but respectful. I was joyful. I loved life. That was my presentation probably until about 10, 11 years old. And around that time, I started experiencing depression. I didn't know what depression was at the time. I just knew that I felt overwhelmingly sad. I wasn't enjoying activities anymore the way that I used to. I had been a competitive gymnast, and I no longer wanted to go to practice. I didn't want to do my homework, and school had been something that I loved and was so passionate about. I was withdrawing from family, spending time alone, just not participating in life the way I always had. And so I remember talking to my friends at school about this and saying, I'm feeling sad, I don't know why. And they would say things to me like, you have this perfect life. You get straight A's. Your parents are married. You get along with your brother. You have all these material things. My family was very comfortable. We went on vacations. My needs were met. And so they would say, why do you feel sad when you have all of these things? And I wondered the same thing. So I felt like I didn't have the right to feel this way, that somehow depression and sadness were reserved for people that had a reason to be upset, that had hardships. And so that became a struggle where now, on top of feeling depressed, I felt guilty and ashamed for the way that I felt. And so when I first started experimenting with drugs and alcohol, that was a new freedom for me in two ways. One being that I grew up in a small town where word travels quickly. And so I went from being Leah with the perfect life to Leah who's drinking alcohol or experimenting with other substances. And so now I didn't have that incongruency anymore between the way I was perceived and how broken I felt on the inside. And so that took pressure off. The other benefit is that using substances numbed my feelings. And so I didn't have to sit in sadness or guilt or shame or confusion. I could just be comfortably numb. And so that became my coping strategy for my adolescent years. The withdrawal from depression continued, but now was driven primarily by substance use rather than by that underlying pain. But I was able to continue meeting my expectations. I went to school. I kept my grades up. I was able to get a scholarship to college. My addiction worsened throughout college. I was using every substance I could get my hands on. And, it eventually got to the point where I tried to end my life because I felt like things would never get better. I was caught in this cycle of desperation, guilt, shame, these things that the drugs had once masked for me. Now drugs were causing. I knew that I shouldn't be using drugs. I knew that this wasn't the way I was raised. This wasn't in alignment with my values or my family values, but it was something I couldn't control anymore. And so I would promise myself every night, this is the last time that I'm going to use substances. Tomorrow I'm going to start fresh. It's going to be a new life. And I wasn't making these promises to anyone else. This wasn't for, my mom's benefit or for a probation officer. I wanted this, but I couldn't keep my promises to myself. And so that's when I got to that point of just utter hopelessness where I felt things couldn't ever be different. And I didn't want to keep trying anymore. It just felt futile. And so I tried to die by overdose in August of 2012. I emailed my mom a suicide note, and the only reason I'm alive is because she had mother's intuition and something told her to check her email at that exact moment, and she was able to call 911 and have help sent to me. That started a long journey for me of this cycle of going to treatment, having a brief period of sobriety, abstinence from substances, and then having a recurrence of use and just cycling through this repeatedly. And nothing was changing. What did eventually change for me was finding out that I was pregnant. That was the motivation that I needed to take the steps to do the work. Because when I look at what didn't work for 5 years when I had these struggles, I wasn't making any changes. They recommend go to 12-step meetings or go to smart recovery meetings, try these things, go to therapy. And so I would show up at a meeting, not participate, and leave. Or I would go to therapy and I wouldn't be honest about what was going on. I would go through the motions, keep it surface level, and say, well, these things don't work. Why do you keep telling me to do these things? And it wasn't until there was another life that I had to fight for that I actually put that effort in and said, let me give this an honest try. And so when I first got sober in October of 2017, I did it solely for my daughter. But somewhere along the way of actually doing that work, I began to find purpose and meaning in life again. And it became something that I now do for both of us. I like to emphasize that because from my experience, doing it for somebody else will never work and will never be enough. And that can be a motivation to get started, but it has to eventually be about yourself and finding your own value. So in terms of how this has impacted me today and how my childhood kind of relates, the reason I liked to start with the early childhood is because that is still who I am. I am still that exuberant, curious, enthusiastic, excited person who loves to learn and loves school and wants to say yes to every opportunity that comes up because I just love participating in life. I love being present, and I'm still that joyful kid that I was. The piece that I think is so important about the middle of my journey and my struggles is that while my interaction with the world and my personality and my presentation was so different during that time, that wasn't ever who I was. And we are not our mental illness. That is a part of us, but it doesn't define us. And so, my characteristics really changed while I was experiencing depression and while I was in my active substance use disorder. But those were never who I was. And so once I was able to achieve recovery and overcome those, I'm still the person that I was underneath. And that has carried through. And so those experiences, like you said in the intro, have really impacted what I want to do with the rest of my life. I spent a long time working as a recovery support worker, and I started to feel really, I don't want to say hopeless, because it's such important work and people are so impactful doing it, but I felt like I wasn't making the difference that I wanted to make, because once people are in that cycle, it's so difficult to break. So I thought back to my childhood and all of these warning signs that I had before I ever picked up substances, the withdrawal, the sadness. I was engaging in self-harm, and there were adults in my life who had seen marks on my arms and were aware of that and didn't know what to do. And so I think back and I wonder, had somebody intervened sooner, had somebody known the resources to connect me with, could my trajectory have been changed? And could I have avoided years and years of pain and suffering? And so that is what inspired me to go back to school and pursue nursing. And so I became a pediatric nurse practitioner with the hopes of kind of reaching these young kids and these adolescents and catching these warning signs that maybe other people are missing, coming from a place of both, the textbook knowledge and the lived experience of understanding. I know what you're going through because I've been there, and it's okay to feel this way, and it's okay to ask for help. So then while in this pediatric program, I started to become really aware of the fact that it's like, well, your body's over here in this box, but your head's over there, and we don't look at the two together. Like, they're separate. We'll treat you from the neck down, but if there's anything going on in your brain, we're sending you to someone else. And our bodies are so connected, and so many psychiatric conditions are actually caused by something medical and vice versa. And so I thought somebody needs to be looking at the whole picture. And so that's really my goal of now pursuing the psychiatric certification is, can I treat the whole person? How can we look at this from, a more comprehensive angle? Because we are one complete person. We're not two separate entities. And so I think when we combine them, not only are we providing better care, but we're reducing some of that stigma too, of like, oh, sorry, that problem isn't one that I can deal with. And so that adds stigma and adds shame when now suddenly your doctor or your nurse practitioner or, whoever you're seeing can't deal with whatever you're experiencing. You start to feel like, well, there's something so wrong with me that even this medical professional can't deal with it. And so, yeah, that's my dream, is just to really combine those and fight stigma.
Thank you. I told you that I'm grateful for this experience, and hearing it again has allowed me to really reflect on so many different things. And there's so many things that I want to ask you, but I think a lot of it is how much it mattered to you to do this first for someone else, and then you found your purpose. One of the questions that I have is, and this is where the ignorance comes in, and I hope like my listeners can relate to this, is I believed for the longest time that someone in substance abuse, it would be obvious to me that they were in substance abuse, and it would lead to their failure. It would lead to this destructive life. And it sounds like you were able to use the substances to allow you to achieve the goal of like numbing those feelings, but it didn't spiral your life in such a quick downward spiral until much later. And this is where, as a mom, as a teen leadership coach, I think that misconception is really important to highlight. So around what age would you say you started with the substances, and then at what age did it really like become a disaster in your life? Because I think like the window, it seems like it's pretty wide for you.
Yeah, it was pretty wide. I think the first time I experimented with alcohol, I was probably 11 or 12. And at that point, it wasn't a daily thing. It was more, I'm having friends over on the weekend. We're going to steal a few drinks from the parents' fridge. There was a lot of getting caught and getting grounded. And then I had my wisdom teeth removed either in middle school or maybe as a freshman in high school. And then I had my adenoids removed as well. And so I had painkillers left over from both of those surgeries. And so that was the next thing that I experimented with, taking 3 or 4 of those and refilling the bottle with something else so that my parents wouldn't notice. And then throughout high school, it was just anything that was available to me. So if somebody else had a prescription that had recreational value, it would be like, well, can I trade? Or, how can I try that? And then by the time I had a driver's license, so junior, senior year of high school, I am a small town New Hampshire girl, but I was going with my friends and staying in cities in Massachusetts and spending time with older men who were supplying drugs and alcohol. But it was still something that was more confined to weekends. I think I might have been using some alcohol or some marijuana during the week, but mostly it was partying on the weekends. And it wasn't until I went to college at the University of Miami that it really became a daily thing. And, that's something I didn't talk about when I shared my story earlier, but the culture there really normalized what I was doing and validated that it seemed like everybody was drinking all of the time. They were going to South Beach. A lot of them were using stimulants to stay awake all night and drink more. There was a lot of like rave culture going on then. And so it didn't seem that wild to me that I was using substances pretty much daily. And, looking back, it's clear now that it wasn't everyone. It was the people I was choosing to surround myself. Mm-hmm. But that's when it started to become daily. But at that time, I didn't have one particular substance that, I clearly preferred or that I was dependent on. And so I really was able to almost use substance use as a motivation or a reward, where I would say like, okay, like, you can't use anything until you get this paper done. Mm-hmm. And so I would write my paper really quickly and turn it in so that I could go party. And so at that point, it wasn't disrupting my life. And it was probably more of like a substance misuse rather than a true substance use disorder. And it wasn't until I started using heroin that it really evolved into something that I could no longer control. And that was at age 19.
Wow, that's a long journey. And when you were talking, I wrote down the cycle that you described. You're right. Like, so you said depression then caused you to feel guilt and shame. And then the substances allowed you to feel numb, but then that caused you to feel more depressed and more guilt and shame. And so I can imagine how it feels good in the moment. And then it just starts to and it has to get bigger and bigger and bigger so that you can get back to that feeling of numbness. And I guess my question again is sort of like, as a nurse practitioner and this knowledge that you are getting on things that are happening in the psychiatric, do you know what happened around age 10 for you? Like, is it puberty? Is it hormones? Or is that like, we don't want to name what it was because it could be so many different things about a person. It can be very dangerous to actually name anything specific.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to put a finger on exactly what it is because, like you said, it can be so many things. It could be one of those. It could be all of them. And so I think a lot of times what we say in mental health care when we say, well, was it A or B? The answer is yes. And so that's kind of the angle we take. And we look at like this biopsychosocial model where from the bio perspective, there may be a genetic underlying vulnerability. From the psychological side of it, you may have personality traits that make you more prone to a negative reaction to a neutral stimuli. And then from the social perspective, what supports do you have around you? What is your culture? How are your family systems set up to support or to not support you? And so it's often not one of these things that's contributing, but the combination of all of them.
And I think you point out, as I started to ask that question, and I was like, wait, what could I be doing by doing that? And I think that's where this stigma is really prevalent, is like, well, and we go back to your experiences, like people were like, why are you sad? You have this perfect life. How could you be sad? And I have heard people say, why is it so hard for people just to choose to be happy? And it's like, oh gosh, that's so like dismissive. And it's not even just a lack of empathy. It's a lack of awareness of like, there are so many different factors that come into that. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to think about, and your whole mission about that stigma, right? So like asking for help, especially when my child is exhibiting self-harm, is shameful for me, right? And so instead of getting my child help, I'm reflecting on how I feel about what I'm seeing and doing, and like the number of things that can get in the way of getting that child help.
And I think from the parent experience, there's a lot of self-blame of what did I do wrong? Where did I fail as a parent? When in reality, it's not about that.
If you're listening to this podcast, you're already part of something bigger. You're part of my advocacy team. Leaders of Today and Peers Not Fears exist to amplify voices at the age when so many of us were having moments that shaped who we became, sometimes in silence, sometimes without support. These conversations are about what happens when voices are heard earlier, when leadership is named, and when young people are reminded that they matter. As we move from building these programs to sharing them more widely, my ask is simple. Help us carry these stories forward. Share an episode, talk about the work, pass it along to someone who works with youth, supports teens, or believes in the power of early leadership. Because when we normalize telling these stories and believing in young voices, we don't just change individual lives, we change what's possible.
But, speaking to that stigma, I work right now as a nurse in a substance use treatment facility, and I ran a group the other day, and the theme was fun in recovery. And so I created this whole addiction recovery themed Jeopardy game. And I was so surprised that one of the questions I had up there was, essentially what you just said, a true or false, people with a mental health condition can use willpower to overcome it. And one of the participants immediately raised his hand and said, true. And I was really surprised. I think in the general public, I would not have been surprised to see that answer. But for somebody who's afflicted by such a stigmatized condition, and that shows the danger of these stigmas, that they become so internalized that he believes that he's there for some moral failing or a lack of willpower rather than because he has a disease. And I remember once hearing someone say that the level of stigma associated with any condition is directly proportional to how much people are blamed for developing it. So when you look at, even with cancer, like if you look at lung cancer versus maybe leukemia, there's going to be more of a stigma with lung cancer because, well, were you a smoker? Did you do this to yourself? When in reality, you can develop lung cancer without ever smoking, or even if you developed it as a result of smoking, it is still a medical condition. And so when we look at mental health stuff, particularly substance use, so many people are like, well, you made that choice to pick up a drug or alcohol. And I always find that so amusing in a way, because how many people in the world have picked up alcohol? It's so acceptable and normal. And so it's really, I think, important to look at, well, why do some people pick it up and not develop a problem? And it's not about the fact that somebody had a drink. It's about the fact that they have a mental health condition. They have a disease that then became problematic as a result. But the behavior of picking up a drink was not problematic in and of itself.
Yeah, I think you just really hit a nerve on me. I think a lot of times we put ourselves above these, bad feelings, but when you talked about lung cancer, I immediately felt that blame. I immediately went there. And so I don't think any of us are immune to the bias of stigma and the choices that we believe people are making in terms of those substances. And that that hit home, and in a good way for me to sort of reckon with how I feel. I've been working very hard at being more aware of stigma and being more aware of the words that I use and the way that I talk and how I push blame on the individual rather than the experiences and the environment. And I really love to be able to credit your challenge to a problem. And I think it's really important that you're out here sharing this message because you did have, quote unquote, the perfect life. And so you showcase and you shine a light on the fact that it doesn't matter. Mental health hits all of us and nobody is immune. I really wanted to go back a little bit on the statement that you made about how many times you were making promises to yourself and how it didn't hold value. And we think, again, it comes back to that willpower statement that you were making. You had the willpower, you had the desire, and yet it kept not working. And I think that's another piece that is shining a light on something that we don't talk about, is like, you made the choice to save yourself. You kept doing it. And yet that wasn't the problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really important to recognize that distinction that I made of that these were promises to myself and not to someone else, because I think a lot of people have this mentality of, if somebody's on probation and they're struggling, of like, well, they don't actually want it. Like they're only doing it to appease, the law. Or if it's somebody who is, in a living environment where they have to have negative urine tests to be able to stay there, if they struggle, it's because they didn't want it. They were trying to cheat the system to gain something. And so where I had nothing to lose or gain based on this, and, of course there was plenty to lose, but nothing direct in that sense. There was nobody, watching over me, making ultimatums. That is, I think, where it really shows how powerless one can feel in that moment, that desperation, because it didn't matter who I said this to. There was nobody to enforce whether or not I was using it, but I desperately wanted to stop and I just couldn't. And, I remember feeling like I was on autopilot where I would use it and truly believe that that was the last time. And the next day I was going to get up and go to class. And then I would find myself back in my dorm using my substance of choice and wondering, like, how did I get here? And almost not even remembering driving across the city and obtaining it. And so it just became this muscle memory and this automatic thing where, I just felt so trapped.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, again, like the stuff that you're sharing is something we don't often talk about as like, how did I get here? And it's so easy for somebody on the other side to like make a judgment, make a blame on like, you definitely had control. And like, it's so hard to feel that judgment and that blame and the same judgment and blame that you were feeling from yourself. So like the cycle was just way bigger than any one person could ever manage. And I really love the aspect of you taking both. Well, there are a lot of things that I love. Number one, I love that you are like, when I was here, I couldn't solve the problem because the problem was already too far gone. So if I go back in the cycle and you go to be a pediatric nurse practitioner, you're hitting it at the ground level. And maybe you don't save every person, but you're getting them before they're to the point where you were feeling like this problem is just too big for yourself when you were experiencing it. But then when you were trying to help other people, the problems were just too big and there wasn't an easy solution. And not that it's an easy solution when they're younger, but it's easier. So tell me how you are going this dual degree to reach more parents. Like, are you going to just have a pediatric practice that allows this to be part of the conversation? I'm going to ask you this hard question because I see the power that you have behind your voice. Are you going to work to really try and help train other pediatric professionals about this experience?
So I actually love that you just directly asked that because I did recently complete a certificate in nurse education. And I do really want to work in academia and work in training other people. For the last few years, I've actually been going in as a guest lecturer for the substance use disorder day for the behavioral health nursing course for new nursing students. And so I've been able to go in and deliver their lecture and incorporate my own experience. And my hope with doing that is to help fight some of the stigma in people going into the healthcare field. And actually, that was something I didn't talk about today when I shared my story, was how much stigma I faced from healthcare professionals. So when I first found out that I was pregnant, I went to an urgent care and I asked for help. And I remember feeling like that was the first time in a long time that I had hope, because I had a reason now where I really wanted to stop using. And I hadn't directly gone and asked a provider for help for years. And so I went in and I was waiting. And then this doctor came in and just completely demonized me, implied that I had no business being a mother, that, I should just stop using, and offered me no resources, no help, nothing. And so I left there feeling so defeated that I ended up using for several more months before I actually was able to ask for help again. And so it's so important to me to fight stigma within the healthcare community, not just out in the general public, because so many people that are nurses, doctors, still have these stigmatized views of substance use disorder. So my hope is that by being a part of education and working with these future nurses, that I can help shift some of their opinions and the way that they're going to deliver care. And, I've encountered people who have really pushed back on some of what I'm saying. And I love that in the classroom, because having that open conversation might change an opinion, but at the very least, it's going to show somebody where their biases are. And so I had a woman who raised her hand when I was talking about the disease model and not necessarily having choice or having power once it's developed. And she said, well, do you have any evidence of that? And I said, I don't have anything prepared today, but yes, this is a well-researched and documented thing. And she came up to me after the class and wanted to talk about it more. And it turns out that she had grown up with two parents who were actively using substances and had a lot of anger because of that. And we went back and forth, and it became pretty clear that I wasn't going to change her mind about the disease. But I said, what's really important is that you recognize that you have this bias and that you have these opinions, and that you don't let it impact the care you give, because it will kill somebody. And I think that she understood that. And a lot of places will allow people to swap patients if there is some type of countertransference going on and a personal connection or bias. Even in the sense of, if I just lost a family member to some rare disease and now a patient comes in with that can be really emotionally triggering.
Yes.
And so just in the sense of that. And so when we look at, maybe I have a bias against people with a substance use disorder because of the way I grew up, that if I get a patient that comes in, I shouldn't be the one to care for them. And so I hope that by providing that education and opening the space for a dialogue about it, that people can just recognize their shortcomings in the care that they will provide. And then in terms of where I see myself working, I'm not sure right now. I would love to kind of do an embedded role in a pediatric primary care office. I haven't seen a lot of that out there, which is kind of why I pursued this. but I'm not sure how to break into that right away. And I'm just wrapping up my psychiatric program now. I have 2 weeks left until I graduate, and then it'll be time to really figure out where I'm going. And it might be that I need to start working just in a general psychiatric setting first, or a general pediatric setting first, and get my foot in the door and make some of those connections. But I do hope to really bring the physical health and the mental health together to treat whole health.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to just reiterate for my audience that biases, having them are not bad, right? We all have them. It's when we know we have a bias and we do nothing about it. So in the case of that woman who came to talk to you, recognizing now that she has that bias allows her the opportunity to remove herself from that experience. And it's going to take her a really long time. It's going to take us a really long time, especially if we don't know we have that bias. And so I want to just go back to when you were talking about lung cancer. I felt that, right? And so that's my bias. And I just want people to know that you can feel this resistance if you pay attention to it. But like, a lot of times we feel that if we have a bias, we're a bad person, right? So if I realized that I had this bias about, blaming somebody who smoked for lung cancer, and then I just ignored it, that's when it's bad. But I didn't create that bias in myself. Something was there that created it. So I think it's really important for us to, especially when we're talking about stigma, is becoming more aware of these experiences. So by having these conversations that you're having, you are just bringing that up for people. And I think that's so powerful. And I really love that you are doing guest lectures. I wrote down that I hope that you see yourself doing a lot more teaching and talking about your experience, because I think it's really, really important for everyone, especially healthcare professionals, to know that we have biases and know that substances are a huge area of where our biases come in. And so when we dismiss the person for the action, we miss the opportunity to really care for that person. And I think that's your ultimate goal, is about providing care.
Yeah, absolutely. And education.
Yeah.
And so when I think about what are my biases, because I was thinking about that as you were talking about the lung cancer thing, as somebody in healthcare, I am very, pro-vaccine, pro-medicine, and pro-harm reduction. And so having done a rotation in a pediatric ICU and seeing horrific injuries from children not wearing helmets, that's something where I have a lot of bias. And so the important things there are, like you said, recognizing the bias, knowing it's there, but then providing the best care possible to that child and providing the education to the family in a non-judgmental way, not your kid's in this condition because you didn't wear a helmet, but from an angle of, in the future, if you encourage helmet use and if you model helmet use by wearing one yourself, this type of injury can be reduced or prevented. And just coming from a place of compassion and not blame, because I imagine most parents in that situation are already feeling extremely guilty. And I'm getting a little off track from mental health here, but just that reflection on, we all have biases and we encounter them daily.
Yeah. So Leah, as you are moving in this direction of the world is your oyster, how do people connect with you if they want to learn more about what you're doing and they see a way to help what you're doing build more with them? What's the way to connect with you?
I would say email is probably the best way. It is rothchild.leah@gmail.com. Rothchild is ROTHCHILD, and then Leah, LEAH.
Awesome. So can you share some advice to a teenager or a parent who has a teenager in that feeling of, I feel something, it doesn't feel right in my body? What advice, or who resonates with any part of your story, what advice do you have for them?
I would say for the parents of a teenager who might be struggling, my biggest advice is to listen, encourage open and honest communication without judgment, and to seek help. When I was first struggling, I had asked my mom if I could see a therapist. And being an appropriately concerned mother, she wanted to know exactly why I wanted to see a therapist. And I wasn't ready to share with her. And so I ended up not seeing a therapist because of that. She did tell me, looking back, and if you recall from when I described myself in childhood, I said I was a little defiant. She said that she did, after some time, come around and say, okay, you can see a therapist. And then I was like, nope, too late. You lost your chance. So I wasn't easy to work with either. But I wonder what would have been different if she had just said yes right away and made that connection. So just listening. My parents always had the mindset of, if you go to a party and you drove yourself there and you need a ride home, like, just call us, no questions asked. I really encouraged that as well, because that's harm reduction, right? Like, we don't want to encourage adolescents to drink or use drugs. Right. But more than that, we want to make sure they're not going to get behind the wheel after or get in the car with somebody else who has been under the influence. And so coming from that harm reduction angle of, I don't want you to do these things, and you might. And if you do, your safety is the most important thing. For teenagers who might be struggling, I think the most important thing is something that I heard at a meeting, which was feeling completely hopeless is different than being completely hopeless. And I think back to my suicide attempt in 2012. And I felt completely hopeless. I had tried and tried and tried to stop using substances. I had gone to meetings. I had gone to therapy. I had tried pharmacotherapy for opioid use disorder. And I had my whole Suboxone taper schedule hanging on my wall. And I was really, trying to take these steps and just felt like it was for nothing. Things would never get better. I would never feel better. I would never break the cycle. But looking back from where I am now, I did break that cycle. Things did get better, and I can't imagine not being here for the life that I have today. And so no matter how hopeless things feel, there is always hope as long as you're still alive. So I encourage anybody who is at that point of desperation, who's thinking about suicide or thinking just that things can't ever get better, to reach out and ask for help, because they absolutely can get better.
I love that. That statement is so powerful, because I think there's a lot of us who, when feeling hopeless, think it is hopeless, and there is hope. It's very dim and it feels really far away, but it's there. The other thing that somebody said to me once is, like, if you ask someone and you don't get help, ask somebody else or ask again. And that is really hard. I'm not going to discount the challenge that exists with that, but there is someone out there who wants to help you, and you just have to find them.
Yeah. And, that really speaks to that part of my story where I went to that urgent care and I asked for help and I was just dismissed. Yeah. And, I continued using for months. But when I did finally get the courage to ask for help again, I was met with open arms and I was embraced, and I was told that things would get better, that I had purpose, and I was loved back to life, essentially. Mm-hmm. And had I not made that second attempt to ask for help, I probably would be dead, or I would not have custody of my daughter. I can't imagine where I would be right now if I had not made that second attempt to ask for help.
Yes. Leah, thank you so much for being willing to open up and share your story to me, but also to share your story with others. I think this is one of those stories that the more people hear it, the more things will change. So please, please continue to share this story wherever you have the opportunity.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
Are you ready to help the young people in your life unlock their inner strength and step confidently into leadership? The new workbook from Peers Not Fears, Your Voice Matters, Uncovering Your Unique Leadership. It's designed to help teens see the leader in themselves, step by step. It's not just a workbook. It's the first step towards a ripple effect that could change lives. Let's turn today's teens into tomorrow's titans. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Leaders of Today, Teens to Titans. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with other parents who might benefit from this conversation. Together, we can support our teens in building healthy, positive relationships and become leaders of tomorrow. Until next time, I'm Lorraine Connell, and this is Leaders of Today, Teens to Titans.